Welcome back. We will today be looking at the solidification of Ashikaga power during the era of Ashikaga supremacy, roughly 1392, the end of the Nanbokucho period, the unification of the imperial court, until the beginning of the end for Ashikaga power in 1467, the outbreak of what will become known as the Oni War. But more on that later. Now, for the good news, so to speak, at least for the Ashikaga, the good news. This period really saw, as I said, the consolidation of their power. And roughly the whole Muromachi period, once again, the Muromachi period is the period ruled over by the Ashikaga, where Japan was ruled over by the Ashikaga family, from the Muromachi district of Kyoto. The Muromachi period can roughly be broken down into three parts. The Nanbokucho period, this period of northern and southern courts vying for power with each other. Then this period of Ashikaga supremacy, brought about in many ways by the efforts of a remarkable individual, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, whom we will definitely talk about a lot today. And then the third period, a very long period of the decline of Ashikaga power, which really overlaps and in many ways gives rise to the Warring States period, which we will also talk about this week. This is a long decline, but really oh, I'm sorry, that was too early. Where was I? I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Oh yes, the thing that really defined the Ashikaga period in many ways was the rise of local warlords. Fighting and competition between these local warlords as the Ashikaga shoguns are establishing their power, then solidifying their power, then slowly losing their power. All throughout this period, local warlords do try to assert themselves in various ways. There is a fair degree of social unrest and religious ferment and other kinds of social ferment as well. Basically meaning people rearrange the bonds according to which they interact with each other. Bonds that defined the world of classical Japan, for example, the Shoin system, really undergoes some major changes, and private land ownership, small-scale land ownership, and samurai domination over very local areas, that becomes much more normal, and as that happens, people change the way they think about, about interacting with everybody from family members to people of other social status groups. To give you an example, storage houses change during this period. You go in villages much more from communal, and this began in the Kamakura period, definitely intensified during this period. You go from communal storage arrangements where a village has a communal storehouse and all the important stuff is stored there, to systems where families have their own storehouses. And I think this really mirrors both the the increasingly local nature of economic life, the fact that families are being forced to fall back on their own resources, competition becoming increasingly stiff, and also this mirrors the example of samurai houses, which have always been more based on clan and family identity than on notions of community like village or anything like that. So in many ways, the society of Japan, this is the takeaway from this point, the society of Japan is coming to mirror the society of the samurai, which serves as a new model, eclipsing that of the aristocrats or more traditional modes of organizing local life. And there is also, ironically, economic expansion. As economic life, as social life becomes a lot more local, these areas, these new local areas, newly empowered local areas, where wealth is becoming increasingly concentrated, where less and less is going to Kyoto, they form new ties, new commercial ties. Shipping, for example, in the inland sea expands during this period. Trade in many ways expands during this period. Local rulers, local samurai who come to control a lot of the countryside, increasingly manage that countryside in their own benefit, which in many ways is reflected in the improvement of the area, new agricultural projects, and the promotion of local trade. So, ironically, this localization of society serves to integrate Japan, but in a very new kind of way. You don't just count on your estates to forward produce to Kyoto, where you, of course, will be because you don't want to live on any of your estates. You want to live in Kyoto. And by the way, the only you that counts is the aristocrat. Not anymore. New people start to become more prominent. Merchants start to become much more prominent during this time period. It's a really exciting kind of time where a lot of the foundation for the early modern period and even many of the features of modern Japan are laid. Certainly a lot of the artistic tastes of modern Japan are defined during this time period. And we also see that as the social transformations are going on, or maybe what allows these social transformations to go on, is the weakening of central authority. The imperial court, it maintains its cultural importance, certainly its religious importance, descended from the sun goddess and all of that, the emperors were, and sets a lot of the artistic taste even now. It is very much not a powerful political institution at all. Even the kind of abortive attempt to wrest control from the Kamakura that, for example, Emperor Go-Toba initiated in 1221, that you can't even do that anymore, to say nothing of launching a second restoration like Emperor Go-Daigo tried to do. The northern and southern court period really fatally weakened the power of the imperial court. The southern court lost. The court dominated by the Ashikaga. The northern court won. Essentially, that's what happened. And we can now really talk about the imperial family for a few hundred years after this, really up until 1868, as an institution that that has lost a lot of its power, that has lost pretty much all of its power, but which still maintains its influence and some of its authority. And I think the important difference between power and authority is that power, you can just literally do things or force people to do things, whereas authority, you exist as a you can still persuade people to do things, perhaps, and people listen to you just by virtue of who you are, but it's not necessarily that you can really set the tone of events. And throughout this period, despite the fact that the Ashikaga shogunate really makes some impressive gains in strengthening both its power and its authority, it really, this strengthening of these things is dependent on the efforts of really extraordinary individuals. As we've seen before, in many of these pre-modern governments, if you are a Superman, you can get your will across, you can get your commands obeyed, but if you're anything less than that, if you're, a mere mortal, that becomes a lot more difficult, and if you have a less than capable ruler, you're in real trouble. And most rulers of most places are not Superman. So while Ashikaga Yoshimitsu is able to really secure this period of Ashikaga supremacy that we're talking about today, overall the Ashikaga shogunate does weaken and falls prey to some structural problems that more active rulers maybe were able to navigate. And both of these institutions, the imperial court and the Ashikaga shogunate, become playthings. The imperial court of the Ashikaga and the Ashikaga shogunate the plaything of powerful warlords, who also then begin to interfere in matters relating to the imperial family as well. So really these central institutions, more or less, are completely eclipsed by local institutions by the start of the Warring States period in the mid-15th century. And these local warlords, who were they? Why were they so important in kind of localizing the nature of Japanese political life during this period? I think that from this point on, throughout the rest of the course, we should call them by their Japanese name. And their Japanese name is very simple. It's daimyo. And it literally means big name. That's what they're called in Japanese, the big names. And you can imagine how this came about. Some people sitting around on the street or taking a break or something, or looking at a procession of warriors coming by. Oh, that guy's a big name, daimyo this. Or, some other procession. Oh, that guy's a big name, daimyo, daimyo, daimyo. And it's very simple, and I think it's very evocative. And it leaves a lot of room for the growth of this office. It's not too specific, but it does give you the impression that these people are very important. Who were they? Who were these daimyo? They were local warlords. People who started off rather as the Ashikaga themselves, as these powerful rulers, as these powerful political figures out in the countryside. And these families are indeed very big. They control local areas, and they were not initially able to own land, but they're certainly able to control proceeds from land. Many of them were appointed as military governors by the Kamakura shogunate. Certainly the Ashikaga themselves were a family that, for most of their existence, really benefited from the close association with the Hojo, and certainly were able to stand up to the Hojo even before they overthrew them, maintained their authority. But basically, as the Shoen system collapsed, as the ties to Kyoto and then later on to Kamakura became ever more and more tenuous, the people in the provinces, the actual samurai who controlled local events, were still there, and they kind of became the law. And these families were very great indeed. Families, for example, like the Hosokawa. Here, outlined in blue, these are the great daimyo of the Muromachi period, at least on two of Japan's three main islands at that time. Kyushu is not shown here. Kyushu also had many of very powerful families, the Shimazu, for example. But take, for example, this blue area here. This was essentially controlled by the Hosokawa family. The Prime Minister of Japan from 1993 to 1994 is a descendant of this family. The Hosokawa were very powerful. Other families as well. The Takeda, who controlled land here in central Japan in Kai province, incorrectly here shown as controlled directly by the Muromachi Bakufu from Kamakura. They had a regional control center in Kamakura. The Uesugi family, who controlled Echigo province, very fertile land. The Imagawa family, and the Ouchi in western Honshu, and also controlled land in Kyushu here. And these families were basically local warlords, but in many ways they were local kings. They were tied to the Muromachi shogunate through various mechanisms, one of which was the naming of shugo by the Muromachi shogunate. Now, what is a shugo? A shugo is basically a deputy that the Muromachi Bakufu, the Ashikaga family who controls him, the shogun, says, you now get to be shugo, you Hosokawa, of this whole area right here, And what that means is they are empowered by the Kamakura Bakufu to rule that area as they see fit, but in the with the understanding that this Hosokawa family will follow Ashikaga orders. So yes, you basically get to be king in your local area, but eventually the ideal is that you have to answer to me. That is a way for the Ashikaga to try to control these local areas. And as I mentioned several times earlier now, if you have a very powerful shogun who has authority and who people do look up to, then this can be very effective. There was also a tendency for the Ashikaga to appoint branch families to Shugo status. The Hosokawa were one of these branch families. Some other families, like the Ouchi, were not related to the Ashikaga, but had instead withstood Ashikaga attempts to conquer them or to incorporate them directly into their power structure, to basically to break them. And the Ashikaga had appointed them Shugo then with the understanding that you rule this area at my sufferance. And the Ouchi said, all right. And there were several other families like that. The Takeda family controlled Kai province. They were another one of these families. But basically, Shugo were the most important of these daimyo, and the Ashikaga encouraged them to live in Kyoto, and many of them did. And one other thing that is very, very important to talk about is that as the Shoin system broke down, this this notion of control of land by samurai merged with the idea of owning land. It became okay, according to the law, to now completely own land. And also in practice, land, as we've seen, had been controlled by people who didn't even really own it, by these samurai who didn't really even own it. But now that you had the legal claim to this land and could treat it as your land, and moreover were the military power, the civil, administrative, and the military aspects of government had fused, and the samurai were really in a very, very good position to control these areas even more firmly because they were now doing it in their own names.